welcome back to my channel. My name's Rachel and this is Stitched Up. So today's video is a little bit different because I made myself my own bodice block a couple of years ago and I've not done a lot with it. And so back in June when it was the So Fruity challenge and I made myself a beautiful mauve skirt by True Bias, I wanted just a little boxy top that would work really well with it. Slightly cropped, but with a gathered in waist. And I couldn't see anything in the sewing community, in the pattern community even, that really fit what I was after. And I thought, you know what, surely this isn't going to be too difficult to try and adapt myself, either from a pattern that I already own or from my own bodice block that I did and haven't really used much. So I thought I would just have a go and see how I got on. So I did use an amazing resource from an amazing YouTuber called Bianca, who, if you haven't heard of her, you really should go and check her out because she is incredible. She has a YouTube channel called The Closet Historian and she has lots of drafting videos. She drafts all her own patterns. Her style aesthetic, I would say, is not really mine. She's very 40s, 50s, that kind of era, and that's not really my thing. However, from the perspective of her teaching you how to draft your own patterns from your own bodice block and how she does that, I think it's just amazing. And obviously those kind of skills are transferable into your own aesthetic. So I'd got this idea in my head of the type of top that I wanted, just something short sleeve, drop shouldered, very easy to wear, loose fit, baggy, just pull on over your head, but then tied at the waist. So you can tie it as tight or as loose as you want. And as I say, slightly cropped. So I headed over to Bianca's channel first because I know that she's got an amazing video on how to draft a drop shoulder all-in-one sleeve bodice from a bodice block. But you know what? You could do this from any two-darted bodice block. So I'm sure lots of you have got patterns maybe that you've made, maybe that you haven't made up, but you will have a pattern in your pattern library of a two-darted bodice pattern. So all that is a normal front bodice piece with a bust dart and a waist dart. Simple as that. If you've got one of those in your stash, then grab it if you know it fits you, because I'm going to show you how to create this little top from it. And if you've got your own bodice block, then obviously that's a bonus because you know it's going to fit you absolutely perfectly. Creating your own bodice block is time consuming. It's a worthwhile time investment, I have to say, but it is really time consuming to actually go through the entire process and then sew up all the multiple toiles that you might need to do to get the fit absolutely spot on. But once you've got it, you've got it. What we're going to do is we're going to head on over to my sewing table now, and I am going to show you how I adapted a very simple two-darted bodice pattern into this top and then how I sewed it up, and I'll see you at the end. So we're going to start with your front bodice piece, and I've just traced mine off. You can see here I've put my darts in and I've also put the bust apex in. What we're going to do first is extend the dart legs from the bust dart right up to the apex, because we're going to be slashing and spreading to move the dart up into the arm side. So I have extended a line from the apex right up into the upper half of the arm side, and then what we're going to do now is we're going to cut through the arm side dart leg and one of the dart legs from the bust dart, but not all the way to the apex because we don't want to remove this piece, we just want to be able to rotate it. So I'm cutting through both of these lines that I have just drawn in, and then I'm going to close up that bust side dart, which opens up the excess into the armhole, because this is going to create our new sleeve. So we're just going to tape that little bit down out of the way, and then I'm just going to add a little bit of paper behind the new dart that we've got going up into the arm side, just to close up that space there. Now we're going to take a bigger piece of paper because we now want to be creating our new bodice and extending into an all-in-one sleeve. So we're going to tape this front bodice piece down over some extra paper. So I'm just doing that here, as you can see. And then you're going to need some rulers here because we want to make sure we do everything as accurately as we can. So what I'm going to do to start with is I am going to add on 1/2 inch to the shoulder tip point, which is this bit here of the original front bodice, and then I'm just going to draw across a line from the neck point all the way out because that's going to be into our new sleeve. Next we're going to lower the armhole, and I tend to do this by 1.5 inches possibly. I mean, it's up to you how low you want your armhole. Obviously if this is going to be a sleeveless bodice you don't want it too low because you'll see your bra strap, but for this I want a boxy easy fit, so I think I've dropped it by about 1.5 inches altogether. What I've also done here is I've just trued up the side seam of this bodice as well, because my side seam sort of goes in a little bit to the waist and I want this a boxy fit, so I just straightened it off there. And then I've taken the armhole out by another 1.5 inches there, and all I'm going to do is freehand a curve which is going to form my new underarm seam. It's as simple as that, and then obviously from there I am going to draw a line straight up to what is going to create the new short sleeve, and there we go. It's as simple as that. So this is now going to be my new front bodice. I'm ignoring that waist dart there. I'm ignoring the other dart as well. So I've just scribbled those out to remind me to not do anything with that. And then I am going to just drop the front neckline, because remember I need to make this so it fits over my head without adding any neck closures. So I decided that I was going to drop the front neckline by about 1/2 inch. And then I've marked in where my shoulder point is there because I want to bring out the neckline towards my shoulder point by a couple of inches as well. So this is me widening the neckline so that I can get it over my head without having to have any zip in the back or a tie or anything like that. I just want it to literally lift on and off over my head. So you need to make sure you create enough space for that. So I've now just grabbed one of my pattern rulers, one of my French curves, just to be able to curve that off nicely. Again, this is not an exact science here, guys, and we're going to, when we do the back bodice, we're going to match these together to make sure that that curve works really nicely. But, you know, as a starting point, this is okay. So all I'm going to do now is cut this out. Yes, it's got no seam allowances on at the minute, but until we finish drafting, I don't want to add any seam allowances. So I'm just going to cut this out, and then we're going to work on the back bodice piece. So here is the front bodice piece. I'm just going to mark on it what it is. Obviously I've got my fold line there, so that will remind me that I don't need to add any seam allowance on the fold line at the front. And then I'm just going to put that to one side, and we will now trace out the back bodice and work on that. So here I've got my back bodice block, but if you're just working from a pattern that already works for you, you can just take a copy of it. Again, my back bodice block, because this is a very fitted bodice, because this is what you tend to work from when you are drafting your own, has got a dart in, but I'm just going to ignore the dart because again I don't want this to be fitted, I want it to be quite loose. So I'm just drawing around this, not very well by the looks of things, and I'm going to add in the dart, because whenever you're tracing something off you should always just add in everything, all the markings that are on there, because you can ignore them if you want to, but just draw them on and then you've got them. So I'm drawing on the dart here and just adding in those dart legs with my ruler, which is a bit pointless, as I say, because I am going to be ignoring it in this particular bodice, but anyway. So what we're going to do is we're just going to drop the back neckline pretty much like we did the front neckline. So I'm dropping this by about 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch again, and then I need to raise the shoulder point as well and extend from the neck point all the way out to create my new sleeve. I am moving out the neck line as I did with the front, and then I'm just going to, I was going to draw that in freehand as you can see, but no, I'm doing it properly with my French curve here. Just get a nice curve on that. We'll be matching it with the front neckline shortly anyway, so that we can see how that's going to work. And I'm just dropping the back arm side again by 1.5 inches to match the front, and extending out again by 1.5 inches, and then I'm going to just straighten out the side seam again, because remember my side seam is curved on this bodice, but I want this boxy, so that needs to match up with the front so the side seam hits in the right place. And then I'm going to freehand the new back arm side, which is not brilliant. I am using pen to do this. Ordinarily I would use a pencil, but obviously for the purposes of this, so that you can actually see what I'm doing, I'm using a Sharpie. And then I'm just going to square off the back sleeve. Let's think then. It's the back sleeve, Rachel. I'm squaring off the back sleeve, and then I'm going to cut this out. So that's it. We've now got our back pattern piece as well. So now I'm just matching up the new neckline, as you can see here, and you can see that that is just not going to look great because it needs to curve around your neckline really nicely. So what I'm doing here is I am just sticking them together with some Scotch tape, and then I'm just going to freehand this again. You can use, you know, your pattern master if you want to, but I find it just as easy to freehand. Again, this would be much easier with a pencil, to be honest, but I'm doing it with a Sharpie just to show you how you can get that really nice curve. And then we'll just cut this excess away, and then you can see that new neckline, how it just curves around nicely. So this is what I've ended up with for my all-in-one sleeve bodice. So I have scribbled out the waist dart and added 1.5 inches at the bottom for a drawstring casing. I've lowered the front neckline. You can see the original bodice pattern there. And then what I've done is I've cut along the side dart and opened it up into the upper armhole so that you get this all-in-one sleeve. I've raised the shoulder by about 1/2 inch and then extended that out beyond the original bodice to create my sleeve by about 1.5 inches. And then I've also added in another 1/2 inch to give me a little bit more ease into the front bodice. So then we move to the back bodice, which is basically just the original back bodice. As you can see here, I've extended the shoulder up a little bit and then just traced around to match the front bodice, and then we have our new bodice pattern. So I've created a facing, and all I've done is basically traced around the front and back neckline, as you can see here, and created a front and back facing, which is a depth of 2 inches, and added on a seam allowance of 1/2 inch. So now we're ready to cut out the pattern on my fabric, and I am just pressing my fabric first. This is always really important, guys. You know, don't skip this step because, well, just don't. Anyway, I'm pressing my fabric. I'm just using a cotton lawn that I got from my stash. No idea where this came from, but it will be perfect to twirl this pattern. So I'm going to start cutting out my pattern pieces now. So I want one on the fold of the front bodice because I don't want a seam down the middle. And then the back bodice I'm going to need 2 of, or am I cutting it on the fold? No, it looks like I'm cutting it on the fold. So yeah, I mean, it's up to you what you want to do with this. If you are going to have a centre back seam, then obviously you will need to cut 2 back pieces and obviously incorporate a seam allowance into that, but I am just going to cut the front and back on the fold. I have made sure that my neckline is wide enough so I can get this on over my head without a back neckline closure. That's really important if you are going to be drafting your own bodice, because obviously you need to get it on over your head. So I've made sure with when I created my pattern that I did lower and widen the neckline slightly so that I can get it on and off without having any kind of closure around the neckline, because I just wanted this to be a very simple top. Obviously I'm no expert in self-drafting, I'm very much a novice at this, so I'm learning as I go. So I've added a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the neckline and the side seams, but I have added a little bit more on the sleeves, which is why the sleeve that you can see there looks a little bit wider, because I want to do a double fold there for a finish on the sleeves. And the other two pieces that I need to cut out are obviously the front and back facing pieces as well, which I will need to interface. I'm really aware that this fabric is quite lightweight and sheer. As you can see my cutting mat through it, but that's okay. As I said, this is just going to be a toile, and it's more about seeing how this fits really, and if my measurements and adaptations to the bodice pattern that I started with are going to work. So I'm just going to cut this out, and then we can start sticking this together. I do prefer to use a cutting mat and rotary cutter, because I just find for me that I can get a much more accurate cut than I can using scissors. I find with scissors I end up with lots of little jagged snips in my fabric, and I just think you just get a much cleaner finish, but it's a very personal thing. You might prefer scissors, and sometimes I do use scissors, but mostly I tend to use my rotary cutter and mat. So as I mentioned, I am using quite a lightweight cotton lawn, and it's got sort of like a grid texture to this. I don't think you can see it very well on these images, but I quite like that. I think it's quite a nice take on just something that's otherwise a plain. But I'm just cutting out one on the fold of my front and back neckline facings that I have created here, and then I will interface those prior to me constructing the garment. So now we're going to put the front and back bodice pieces together, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to join them at the shoulder seams first. So I could French seam this. It would probably look better if it was French seamed, but as I say, because this is a toile, I'm not going to go to all that trouble. So I'm just going to pin the shoulder seams together. I'll stitch these on my sewing machine and then overlock them to finish the edges. So here I am at my sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch the shoulder seams now, making sure that I'm using my 1/2 inch seam allowance that I've allowed for. You can see that I'm watching Sequin Girly here. I always like to watch other YouTube vloggers while I'm sewing. I don't know if anybody else does that, or whether they watch Netflix or whatever, but yeah, I tend to put other vloggers on and get a bit of inspiration. Anyway, back to the sewing. So we'll get this done, and then we will overlock the shoulder seams. So now that's done, I am just going to give the neckline a good press. So I'm going to open out the top at the shoulders where I have just stitched and overlocked them together, as you can see here, and I'm going to work from the wrong side. Probably just going to give those seams just a little press, and then we're going to attach the facing, because we need to construct the facing next. So now we're going to look at the facing. So I've got my front and back neckline facing pieces here, and I have cut out some interfacing just using the same pattern pieces, and I'm just going to iron these in place just to stabilize the neckline and give a little bit more structure and longevity to the neckline of this garment. Obviously you want the neckline to be quite structured, I guess, so that it keeps its shape and looks quite sharp. So I'm just going to attach the interfacing. I just generally use woven interfacing with the glue on it, and I'm just going to press that in place very gently, because this is quite a delicate fabric, on the front and neckline facing pieces. And then what we'll do is we will stitch the front and back facing together at the shoulder seams, pretty much like what we've just done with the shoulders of the top, and then we will be able to attach the facing to the top. That's going to be the next step before we move any further on with sewing up the side seams. So we've got the facing all done and stitched at the shoulder seam, so I'm just going to press those seams open. I believe at this stage I have finished the outer edge of the facing as well. If I haven't, I will be doing that, usually on my overlocker. And then we're going to be attaching the facing to the top, right sides together. So I'm now going to lay my top out, so the neckline on the right side is facing up, as you can see here, and then we're going to pin the facing, so it's right sides together. I'm going to pin all the way around the neckline, and then I'll take it over to the sewing machine and we'll stitch at 1/2 inch all the way around the neckline edge. And then what I'll need to do once I've done that is I will clip into that curved neckline to make sure that we can lay the facing nice and flat once we turn it to the inside. And I'm also going to understitch it as well, because that will help it to lay flat on the inside and stop it stretching out. You need to be careful when you're applying facings to necklines like this, because I haven't stay stitched my neckline. And the neckline, before you attach the facing or before you finish a neckline, is always on the bias, or there's parts of it on the bias, so it's very easy to stretch it out of shape, and you don't want to do that because you'll end up with a really wiggly neckline and it won't lie nice and flat against your skin. So you need to be really careful when you are handling necklines. As I say, I don't generally stay stitch them unless I'm applying bias binding, because I feel that I've got enough experience now to be able to handle a neckline without stretching it out. But I would, if I was bias binding it, I would have definitely stay stitch it, because attaching the bias binding tends to pull it a bit out of shape as well. But you can see here I'm just pinning it all around, and then we'll take it to the sewing machine. So we're now at the sewing machine. I've just sped this up a little bit. I am stitching all the way around the neckline with my 1/2 inch seam allowance, as you can see here. And then what I will next do is I will just snip into the neckline with my little embroidery scissors. I like using these because they cut right up to the tip, which just makes it a little bit easier. I'm really sorry about my phone buzzing in the background. It's all my Destash that people are buying. I should turn it on silent, shouldn't I? Anyway, back to the sewing. So yes, you can see that I'm just snipping into the curve all the way around the neckline, and then I'm going to fold over the facing and stitch from the right side through the facing and the seam allowance all the way around. This is understitching, and then it just means that it will lie nice and flat when I come to press it. So when I've finished, this is what it should look like from the inside. You can see the line of understitching there through the facing and the seam allowance. So I'm now back at the ironing board, and I'm using my tailor's ham here just to press the neckline. I find if you try and press a neckline flat, it doesn't always press nicely. So I like to just press it over a tailor's ham. I just think, especially when you've understitched it, it just gives you a really nice crisp finish to the neckline. And then when I've done this and I've done it all the way around, what I tend to do then, especially if I'm using a facing like this, is I will just secure the facing to the main fabric at the shoulder seam using my sewing machine. You can do it by hand if you want to, but I will just stitch in the ditch through the shoulder seam and the facing, just a couple of stitches either side on the shoulders, and it will just again secure that facing inside so it stops flipping out. So before we sew up the side seams, what I'm going to do is I am just going to give it a little press. We're working from the wrong side now, and I've got the garment opened out, and we're going to finish off the shoulder, no, not the shoulder seams, the armhole seams. So you can see here I have my seam allowance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just fold over by about 1/4 inch and then fold over again by another inch, give it a press, and then I will edge stitch it once we take it to the sewing machine. So I'm just using my little hem gauge here just to give me a guide to start with. I generally do this by eye, but I'm trying to be accurate with this because obviously with me self-drafting it, I want to make sure that the fit is how I want it to be, because that's going to help my skills going forward when I come to do something like this again. So I'm just doing a double edged seam here to encase those raw edges nice and neatly, and then I will edge stitch it. So that's one side done. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other armhole, and then we will take it over to the sewing machine. So here we are at the sewing machine. I've got my little edge stitching foot here. I don't know if it is actually a proper edge stitching foot, but it's the one with the little, it's got like a little metal thing, whatever you call it, in the middle anyway, that will allow you to put the fabric up against it so that you can stitch through. And I've just moved my needle across to about a 1.8, and then I can stitch it from the wrong side, and it gives me a really nice finished edge to that seam. So now we've got those seams stitched, I will give them a good press, and then we're going to stitch up the remainder of the side seams. So this is as simple as literally just lining everything up with the bottom hem and pinning together, and then stitching at my 1/2 inch seam allowance and then overlocking the edge. So I mean, you can see by this that I've not got it exactly right, but it's okay. It's going to work. It's going to be fine. Those edges don't match up completely, but there's going to be plenty of room there for my arm to fit through. So it's going to be all right. And I think this is the thing with sewing. I know lots of people talk about accuracy, and in lots of ways and in lots of areas you have to be accurate. But if you don't experiment, you don't learn, do you? So anyway, we're going to get this pinned. We'll just give it a quick press first. Look, we'll get it pinned together, and then we'll go stitch the side seams up, overlock them, and see what we look like at that point. So once we've done that, stitch the side seams, we're going to turn our attention to the bottom hem. So if you remember, I allowed a seam allowance of about 1.5 inches here for the hem casing, because I want to put a drawstring in to this to cinch it in. So once I've pressed it all the way around, I've taken it over to the sewing machine, and at this point I've decided that I'm going to obviously stitch it all the way around, leaving a little bit of a gap so that I can insert my drawstring cord. And then you'll see it dawn on me, like the sun coming up over the horizon, that I suddenly realised that actually when you're inserting a drawstring cord, you do have to leave a little opening at the front. So you need to have grommets in, eyelets, whatever you want to call them, because you have to have the drawstring cords feeding through the right side of the fabric so that you can actually tie them. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at where the center point is of my front bodice and deciding that actually I'm going to have to put grommets in here first. So I will be adding some interfacing just to interface the front little piece before I put my grommets in. So we're now back on the cutting mat, and I've got my little bit of interfacing, and I'm just deciding where I am going to attach this to the wrong side of the front bodice piece in the center, because this is where I need it reinforcing, especially on such a lightweight fabric like this. If you try and insert grommets on something really lightweight like this, it's just going to tear in wearing, even if it doesn't do it straight away. It's just not going to last. So I've put a little bit of interfacing, then I'm going to fold up. I'm just folding up that edge to make sure that that's going to cover it when I'm stitching it. And then what I need to do now is I need to insert grommets into the area that I have interfaced. So it's looking quite good though. I'm pretty pleased with it. I'm a little bit worried at this point that it's actually very cropped, and probably a little bit more cropped than I originally anticipated. But you know, it's just an experiment. It's a wearable toile. So I'm going to get a pen, and I'm just going to mark where I want my 2 grommets. Obviously I need 2 because I'm putting a drawstring through this casing, or what will be a casing, and then it needs 2 exit points for either end of the drawstring to come through so that I can tie it and cinch it in when I'm wearing it. I tend to use 8mm eyelets or grommets, however you want to call them. I've inserted mine here. I've not shown you how I do that. I tend to find that for drawstrings that's about the best size to get them through easily. So I'm now going to take this back to the sewing machine and we'll stitch the casing. That's all stitched in now. I've got my casing all edge stitched really nicely on my sewing machine, and I've got my drawstring cord, which in this case is piping cord because it's all I had to hand at the time, and I am going to use one of these little bodkin things from Hemline that I got to feed it through. And this is why you need a decent sized eyelet, because trying to get a safety pin or bodkin through eyelets can be really difficult. So you do need a decent size, and I find that with a little bit of a wiggle this will go through an 8mm, but yeah, if you go any smaller than that, you're going to struggle getting this through. So I'm just using my little bodkin to feed through my cord all the way round the hem casing, and then once I've done that, I will just have a little wiggle with it and decide what sort of length I want the cord to be. The draw cord inserted, I can then tie it off, make sure I've got enough length there to tie it off. Obviously I'm going to change this for a proper drawstring at some point, but yeah, I've got enough there to be able to tie it in a nice little bow, and my little top is finished. Now to try on. So I hope you enjoyed seeing how I put this together, how I got from a 2-darted bodice to a all-in-one sleeved cropped boxy drawstring waisted top, and my wearable 12 that I'm wearing now. I absolutely love how this has turned out. It does need still a few little tweaks. I do think it should be slightly longer, but you know, for a first attempt, I am super happy with how this came out, and I can see me making up lots more of these. I haven't included how I inserted eyelets into this because I think that's a whole different sort of tutorial of its own, to be honest. But yeah, if you don't have an eyelet setter, or you're really nervous about doing that, you could always just insert a little piece of elastic instead. But for the purposes of this, I wanted to have a little drawstring waist. But I hope you've really enjoyed having a look at how I made this top and how I put it all together. And I'm hoping that I will be back with more drafting videos in the future. So leave me a comment down below, and I will be back with you really soon. Take care. Bye.